Talk about best practices when it comes to React that can enhance your skills and help you stand out as a candidate in the workforce. If you're new to this channel, consider subscribing. Code Emily is a place for React tutorials, JavaScript tutorials, and different advice videos. And on that note, let's get right into best practices. Best practice number 1 though is subscribing to Code Emily. Avoid prop drilling. If you're needing to pass down more than 3 or 4 props to a component, you might want to consider a rewrite. The reason for this is because the more props that you're passing down to a component, the more bug prone that component becomes. There are different ways to handle this. Consider potentially passing down an object rather than individual props. That, or it might be time for a rewrite of that component. Keeping your components as small as possible. 1, this will be a theme in this video, but 1, they're more easily testable. But 2, we then can extract logic into smaller files, and then when something goes wrong, if a bug occurs, it's much more clear as to where that bug can be fixed. And if another engineer goes into your code, they don't have to reverse engineer all that code that you've written because it's already broken down into small files that are easier to parse. Couple rules of thumb: if your file is anywhere over 200 lines or so, you could consider a rewrite. If you have to have multiple use effects in your file, it might be time for a rewrite. There's tons of logic at the top of your file, also might be time for a rewrite. Another thing too that's really nice is having 1 component per file. This way, if you're looking for a component, you can easily search for that file. Folder organization. Folder organization is one of my passions in life, I'm not gonna lie to you. Having a place where everything in your codebase goes will help that codebase drastically. Therefore, if you need to grab a button component, for example, you know exactly where that button component lives. Of course, a button is a very simple example, but if it's a component that you're looking for, but you can't find it in that component folder, it slows you down and therefore slows development process down, and you might end up making a new component for something that already exists in your code base, which is repeating code and also adding more time onto the development of that feature. So for folder organization, there's multiple different folders that I suggest you have. A components folder, always. A hooks folder makes sense in some instances. The hooks folder would be where all of your custom hooks would live if those are in your project. So for folders, we have components, we have hooks. An icons folder could make sense if you have icons. Route or page folder makes sense for different pages or route throughout your app. A theme folder if you have a theme, and a utils folder. Within that utils folder would be all of your shared functions that you need throughout your app. Those could be something like formatting. Formatting should go in the utils functions, different things like that that are throughout your app where you're using the exact same function in multiple places. It's best to extract those functions from your code and have them live in one place that you're then importing within your files, rather than writing the same function multiple places because, hey, if it breaks one place, you might not notice for a long time. But if you're using the main function and that breaks, it'll break everywhere, which I know sounds worse, and in some ways it is, but you'll notice right away. That bug will get fixed very quickly. Another thing is that it's testable. We can test that one function, that one place. And if we want to update that function, we can update it everywhere by just changing that one top level parent function. Comment when needed, but don't rely on comments. Comments are good to add if they're necessary, but it's best to write code that doesn't need to rely on comments. Naming is one of the biggest things in engineering, and you don't really realize that a lot of your job is going to just be figuring out what to name things when you go into software engineering, but it is. And naming doesn't just apply to React components. It also applies to different functions that you're creating. If I were to create a function, say it was to create a square, but I called that function create shape, but there was no way to create any shape except for a square. Another developer comes into this code base and they're looking to create a circle, and they find that function called create shape. They say, oh, must be able to create a circle with this too. But then after some reverse engineering, they figure out that you can only create a square with that function. That, I would say, is a naming issue, because when they created that function, they should have called it create square instead of create shape. That's a simple example, but at the root of it, naming can make such a huge difference in your code base. It can be night and day, truly. It all goes along with organization, etc. But if I'm looking for a search bar component, I'm gonna look for a component called search bar, not a component called look for this thing and blah. But really naming things what people would expect to search for, what makes sense, and exactly what that component or function is doing is what it should be named. And same with variables. Use useMemo only when necessary. I have a video all about it that I'll link right up here, but useMemo can really help your application quite a bit, but it also could hurt it. What useMemo is, if there's a call in one of your components that takes a lot of time, it really slows things down, useMemo can be the way to go. It will memorize a value and not have to keep running that really expensive call or function, which could save your application quite a bit. However, adding too many use memos can also slow down your application, so definitely use sparingly and look into useMemo because it can help you a lot or hurt you a lot. Double-edged sword right there. Keep state at the bottommost level, unless the parent component needs it. What I mean by this is if state is only needed in that one component, keep it in that component. There's no need to put that in the parent. If the only component that needs that state is the child component, that's where that state should live. A good front end includes focusing on a good back end. Front ends should be built using the back end data. They shouldn't be doing a ton of back end logic. The front end should be consuming what's coming from the back end. And pushing for good APIs in your team, good back end APIs, is a big part of a good practice when it comes to React and JavaScript and being on the front end in general. Less code does not always mean better code. One example of this is double ternary operators in JavaScript. It's less code to write a double ternary operator, but it's way more clear to have two if statements. It's the same thing with all of React and JavaScript code. What we want to focus on is keeping our code clear, legible, readable, and therefore less bug prone. Consider the user experience always, above all else. User experience is the most important thing in your front end. You want your user to completely understand what's going on when they open up your application. You don't want them wondering why a button's here, why this is there, why is that there. If a design is brought to you and you don't agree with the design, or not even just if you don't agree with it, if you're not sure why it should work this way, if you have questions, ask those questions. Because if you don't understand it, it's very likely other people will have the same problem. It will never hurt to ask those questions. But if it does, that's a whole issue in itself. Pull requests and code review. It's so important to have your code reviewed by other people. When you're reviewing your own code, you do sometimes miss big things because you've been staring at that code for how long? It's your baby at that point, right? But making sure your code is reviewed and also making sure to leave valuable comments. Once again, if something doesn't make sense to you in someone else's code that they've written that you're reviewing, ask why they wrote it that way. Even if it's not, you need to change this. Just asking why is so important because maybe they don't really realize why they did that. Maybe they missed it. And if it doesn't make sense to you, it probably won't make sense to somebody else. I know I already said this, but writing tests. Unit tests and integration tests are both really important for React. Please comment below if you found this video helpful. If there's anything else that I could provide you with that would be helpful, any more tips and tricks, any interview help, etc. I have other videos about interview stuff and I am happy to help because it's hard out there. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time. Are you a React developer? Saying the word developer is not working for me today.